So I just wanted to make sure that you are keeping that on your radar for that homework assignment. I think it's like 4 or 5 questions, so it's not going to take you long, but free points, essentially easy points, open book, open note. So please make sure to get that done. So now I'm in the part 2 of the slides on the gymnosperms. And so now I wanted to think about some of the other phyla besides the Temporophida. So that's what you've been covering, but we have the cycads, the diphyll, and the needlephytes left to do here. And so I showed you this before, I think, where we were looking at the idea that when you are seeing these plants in their current, in 2024, some of them were way more abundant back in the day than what we see now. So, people, cycads, they're less abundant now, but they had a time period where they were pretty flush and pretty successful. You can see with the conifers, Chenophyta or Chirophyta phyla, but you can see that it has really become quite successful when you look at the 4 different phyla. Oh, before we get into the other phyla, I wanted to say a little something about the progression of conifers. When you have that baby sporophyte in the seed, it's hopefully that seed's going to land somewhere, germinate and grow. And initially, when you see a young conifer seedling, all the needles or the leaves are just single. They're just on the stem in a single pattern. And it isn't until roughly they're 2 years old that you start to see a shift where the new growth will show that they can be bundled instead of just being born singly on the stem. And so when they start to bundle, then we start to use the word fascicle. So a fascicle is a bundle of pine needles or leaves. And that's one of the ways that we can identify them. You count how many pine needles per fascicle, and that's characteristic of these different species. And so, but initially when they're really young, they just have a single pine needle attached to the stem. So if you take one of the pine needles or leaves and put them in cross section, you've seen this already when we were looking at leaf anatomy. They're pretty simple. Their stomata are slightly recessed. Remember now with the conifers, they're evergreen, so they tend to retain their needles for a long time, not permanently. Evergreen is a little bit of a misnomer, but basically that term is trying to get at the idea that when you look at a conifer tree, they do look evergreen, but there's a continual renewal. Like some of the needles will fall off. I'm sure you've noticed that when you've been out hiking around that there's needles on the forest floor. So obviously there's needles falling off. They just don't do it all at once. And so it's a subtle thing. And so that's why the trees always look evergreen. Here, what this image is, you'll see something like this in lab too, where there's 3 needles on this left image that got cut in cross section. So this is a fascicle that they, where you had a bundle of 3 pine needles that got cut in cross section. So that's why it looks that way. And then the right picture is just zooming in on one of the needles or leaves. And again, pretty straightforward, simple anatomy. Remember with the gymnosperms, the Pinus genus, they don't have the fancier xylem and phloem. They just have tracheids, rib cells, so they're nothing fancy on that. So sunken or recessed stomata, with their leaves being long-lived like this, where they don't drop them for quite a stretch of time, they think having that recessed stomata is important so that it helps them not become too desiccated. So in the winter, conifer trees around here are often dormant, but not always. On a nice, sunny, warmish winter day, they can activate and become more physiologically active. So if they are going to do photosynthesis and they open their stomata, having that slight recessed anatomy helps to make sure that they're not losing water too quickly. We may have a lot of snow around here in normal winters, but remember that's kind of hard for for them to access frozen water. So they have to rely on whatever water's in the ground. So with the all the gymnosperms, if you look at every plant that's in the gymnosperm category, there's about 720 species still living, and phylum Pinophyta is the biggest. And just within the Pinus genus, there's about 90 species, but there's other genera besides Pinus. There's other ones out there. If we just tend to focus on that one as an example when we go through the life cycle. All right, so they by far are the winners in terms of numbers. But the other three phyla, I wanted to do an overview of those now. And so this is another one, the phylum Cycadophyta, sorry. And so these are not so abundant. There's only about 11 different genera, only about 140 species total. And they don't look like gymnosperms. They look like some kind of palm tree or shrub-like palm plant. And so their leaves look very much like palm tree leaves. But when you look at their stem tissue, they truly have secondary growth, which means they form secondary xylem and wood. And we don't see that in palm trees. Palm trees don't have, their tree trunks are not secondary growth. They don't have wood in there. So, but anyways, they are not found naturally this far north. They can't handle our winters. They're in tropical and subtropical regions. And during the Mesozoic era, which was the so-called age of the dinosaurs, botanists like to say it was the age of the cycads rather than the age of the dinosaurs. You're want to be a botanist now. And so Mesozoic era, and lots of cycads that were typically much bigger than what we find today in size. So these that you're looking at, these images, these are Zamia pumila plants, and based on the naming and classification, but it's the only one native to the United States, and it's in Florida. So it's the only one that makes it this far north into the United States. A lot of people, when I was in Florida for a conference, I noticed people would landscape where they would use, essentially a living fence instead of having a board fence. They would use plants to create a fence. And very often it was Zamia because it's very dense growth like that. So if you go to other regions of the world, especially subtropical, or like over to New Zealand or Australia, you'll see that cycads get bigger and they look more tree-like. So that's what you're seeing here. So some of them can be 18 meters high. So this is a word, I can't remember if we formally introduced this idea yet. I know we've talked about monoecious. Dioecious is another term that I'll be asking you to know. Dioecious. Di means two. Ecious means house. So this is saying two houses. What that is implying is that you have female cycad plants, and then you have separate male cycad plants. Two different houses for where you find the male and female parts. Okay, so a dedicated female plant, dedicated male plant, dioecious. We'll talk more about that when we get into the angiosperms. Be careful with them because if you have to buy small ones, small cycads for your home as a potted plant, just be aware that they can be carcinogenic. You chew on them, there can be neurotoxins in there, so don't let your kids or pets at those. I had to get rid of my cycads for that reason. I just didn't want to risk any of it. And then this picture on the lower left, those red dots, if you look at their stem tissue, they often harbor cyanobacteria. And whether they're the ones producing some of these nasty chemicals or not, I don't know if they've teased that out yet. but you can definitely see in many species that they harbor these cyanobacteria. But they can be quite beautiful. People use them in landscaping. Looks like one of them was falling down. They had to support it with some boards, but they can be quite beautiful and dramatic. But again, it's understandable why people would say, oh, look at those palm trees, especially when they have a tree-like growth form. But they belong to the gymnosperms. So here, this is a female cone, a female plant with a female cone. Here is female cone on the left there, so the female plant. Their cones are quite robust, but the male cone is definitely taller. So in the cycads, the male cone is actually bigger, which is weird. That's not usually the case. The other thing that they've been noting is that insects appear to help in pollination. So up to this point, when we've been looking at the Pinus life cycle, I didn't say anything about insects. It was wind currents, typically, that we think about for dispersal of the pollen. Here they find with cycads, there seems to be a lot of dedicated insect movement between plants, and that helps with delivering the pollen from the male cycad plant to the female. So we'll talk more, of course, about this idea of other organisms helping out with pollination, especially getting to angiosperm. So here the male cone is on the left and the female on the right. And then a close-up of the leaves, which look very palm-like. So landscaping, these are very popular in landscaped environments. They're very dramatic. You can get them in different sizes. This is demonstration on some of that. Mexico City. And so you can easily be fooled because they look like little cute palm trees. But they're gymnosperms. This one too is kind of hard to wrap your head around that it's a gymnosperm because this one actually looks like an angiosperm. So phylum Ginkgophyta is the maidenhair tree. So Ginkgo biloba, it's the only one left. Everything else has gone extinct. And very beautiful fan-shaped leaves, so no needles. It can grow quite high, quite tall. It's fairly slow growing, but you can often see it in rural, urban environments, in landscaping and along roadways, because it's pretty successfully resistant to pollution. And the other weird thing is that it drops all of its leaves at once, deciduous. So in the fall, it will drop its leaves. That's unusual. That's not what we see with the conifers. And separate plants. So there's a separate female ginkgo, and then there's a separate male. And you have to be careful because you don't really want the female plant in your landscaped environment. You just want the male plant. And I've heard case studies where people didn't understand this and they ordered the wrong one for their landscaping. And once the tree reached, it went through juvenile phase and got to be mature and started producing the cones, they realized at that point that they were female. And the problem with that is they can be very smelly to our nose. We don't appreciate the smell. And if you can imagine a bunch of these trees in an area where there's a bunch of people, not a very popular plant. So they had to dig those up and replant the male version. On the other hand, though, there's some people who will take the female, the seeds once those have been formed, and they're considered a delicacy in certain groups of people. Even though it smells bad, they still will eat it. So it's considered a delicacy. And it smells bad, but once you get past the smell, apparently it has a delicate fish taste. So some people really like that. I think I've showed you this already, the idea of quite a large tree. And they tend to be pretty long-lived because they can handle the pollution in cities. But yeah, beautiful fan-shaped leaves. They don't look anything like a gymnosperm, what you would think of. And the female ovule there, very simple. They don't really have anything fancy. And then the male cones are very, very simple. So they have kind of unusual way of delivering the sperm. And they actually have the pollen kind of gets a little bit more aggressive at using nutrition of the female tissue. And so they have some funky things going on when they get to that stage of their development. But again, you have two sperm that will be delivered by each pollen grain. And it's just a little different, a little bit more, the pollen seems to need more help, I guess. It needs nutrition from the female sporangium tissue. So it feeds off of that as it's continuing to grow and get the sperm delivered. Anyways, all right, what about phylum Nidophyta? So this has 3 living genera still left. The Nidum, the G is silent, Nidum, Ephedra, and Welwitschia. So not much to look at. There's about 71 different species within these 3 different genera. So let's look at Nidum first. That one tends to be a vining plant. They like to vine around tropical trees. And their leaves are pretty tough and leathery. But again, very simple. The red that you're seeing there, that's the female. And so they have male Nidum plants and female Nidum plants. So they're dioecious. So we don't have these around here. And most of them are vining. There's some tree species, but most of them are vines. But believe it or not, even though they have that very angiosperm looking leaf, they're not. They're gymnosperms. Now, Ephedra is even more kind of simple. It's just stem tissue primarily, very shrubby. It's been called Mormon tea, Ma Wong. This one has a long history of ethnobotany use. It's out west, and the leaves are pretty much very thin and papery, scale-like. Their stems are green and photosynthetic. They can either have one plant that has male and female, so monoecious, or they can be, depending on the species, they might be dioecious. Very simple. So these are pollen cones. And female cones. Very, very simple. So you may have, Ephedra may sound familiar to you, perhaps. Ephedra was on the market for a while as a supplement, like a pill you could take to help you lose weight. I think this was back in the 90s or 80s. Unfortunately, it speeds up your heart rate enough that if you already have heart issues, it can cause problems. And there were some people who died from taking these Ephedra supplements. So they took it off the market. I don't know if it's used in any other way legally currently, because again, it messes with your heart. And if you already have some issues, it can be deadly. But I know in other countries, Ephedra is still being used. So just be aware that you have to be careful with this. If you go traveling and they are offering that as an option for herbal tea or whatever, be careful. The last one in this Nidophyta group is Welwitschia. Only one species remains, Welwitschia mirabilis. And so this one's bizarre. It buries most of its body in the ground. You see this, just the tip of the stem. And then two strappy leaves, big leaves on either side of the stem will grow out, and then they'll just flop onto the desert floor. And then over time, with living its life and dealing with its environment, those two strappy leaves tend to get shredded and look like a hot mess. So that's why it tends to look more like that. But those are technically two leaves that just got really, really shredded over time. And again, as far as I know, the only place that's still located is in the Namib Desert. I don't think they found it anywhere else. So that's on Southwest Africa, right on the coastal region. And so this plant primarily relies on like, fog rolling off the ocean for its water source. It's relying on fog pretty much and the occasional rain. So it is an amazing plant in how it can survive such extreme heat, very little water. Here you can see on the left, that's the pollen, male pollen cones, and on the right, the larger structures, those are the female. So pretty simple. And they're popular with lizards and other desert dwelling animals because they're usually a spot where you can find some insects crawling around. So they're a good food source for some of these other animals that have to eke out their living in a very hostile environment. So this group, the phylum Cnidophyta, they're unusual in a couple respects. They are compared to the other three phyla we've talked about in this gymnosperm group, we see that there are some angiosperm features in this particular phylum. So they actually do have some vessels. This is a noted exception. Most gymnosperms by far only have tracheids for their xylem. However, some of these species and cnidophytes, they can have vessels. So that really started to get them scientists interested, like, oh, okay, what's going on here? They look kind of like angiosperms in that regard. We also see they don't have true archegonia tissue in the Cnidum genus and in Welwitschia, which we don't see archegonia in angiosperms either. That goes away in the angiosperms. So the fact that these couple of plants don't, like, oh, okay. So I've asterisked these two sub bullets, the vessels and this lack of archegonia. And now they're saying the current thought is that these vessels, lack of archegonia, they think it is independent of. And so they were initially saying, oh, maybe the angiosperms, the cnidophytes are the immediate ancestor to the angiosperms when they started seeing all of this. But now they're saying, maybe not. Maybe they had a common ancestor and came off of that rather than the cnidophytes being the immediate precursor to angiosperms. Another angiosperm-like feature is that some of the strobili, when you look at them, they look like flower clusters that you see in angiosperms, those inflorescences. So when you have lots and lots of beautiful flowers all grouped together, we start saying, oh, those are inflorescences. The other odd thing in the neophytes is that, remember, the pollen grains can have two sperms, and then we say one fertilizes the egg. In the Pinus life cycle, we said one fertilizes the egg, the other one dies. This one, we have one fertilizes the egg. The second sperm fuses with a different cell, but not much happens. So that may sound weird and like, so what? But I want you to keep this in mind because when we get into the angiosperm, we're going to find out that each pollen grain will have two sperms, and each of those sperms will do something very significant. to create a seed that's very special. And so again, this is another angiosperm fig tree. But again, they're saying, you know, this is probably the idea that neophytes and the angiosperms probably had a common ancestor that they diverged and speciated off. We also see some beetles and especially some crawling insects seem to be important in some of these groups to get pollen transferred over to the female ovule. By far, wind is still really a player in pollination. So we think all of this taken together, we think that neophytes, yes, they are of the gymnosperms. They are the most closely related to the angiosperms, but the angiosperm and the neophytes had a common ancestor. And then the neophytes came off of it, and then the angiosperms came off of it. All right. So there's been a lot of debate over this over the last decade or so, but that this is the current thought. So when you look at a phylogenetic tree trying to represent this concept, they often do something like this, where the common speciation off of that common ancestor. So that's the current thought, and they're sticking to it so far. And then you can see the other gymnosperms are off of that, further away. Okay. The last slide is a summary table of the 4 different phyla. Please start committing, if you haven't already, to memory the different names of the phyla. I'll be asking the phyla. But this is your one-stop shopping to kind of do some comparison. So we're looking at vascular tissue, sperm, whether they're moldable or not, pollen tube, and how to know something about the true sperm conveyor, types of leaves. Okay, so that's kind of a survey of the other 3 phyla. By far, we tend to focus on phylum Pedophyta and the Pinus genus in particular, but don't forget about these other 3. They're cool gymnosperms as well. Any questions on those 3 groups? All right, well, let's shift into the final, well, close to the final topic, which are the angiosperms. That's the next topic. So we need to cover features of the angiosperms. This is a massive group. So there's some things I'll be pointing out. There's over 250,000 different species. So obviously I won't be asking you to get too far into that. Let me go back here. So we're going to cover a little bit of anatomy of angiosperms with regard especially to their flowers. We're going to be zooming into that because we need to think about that in detail when we look at their reproductive process. How do they form their seed, fruit? And then we will also spend some time looking at fruit design as well. And then we have some lab exercises that will be backing that up. So, a couple of big differences here between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So we said that gymnosperms produce naked seeds. But now with the angiosperm, they are very protective of their seeds. So they will encase them in fruit tissue and use that to further protect them, hopefully help disperse them so that they get far enough away from the mother plant that they will not compete directly with the mother plant, will be able to colonize new habitat and live their life. So here is a comparison with the female cone with the gymnosperms and how the ovules are found on the scale of the cone. And that's where we can see where the hydrogen is, where the archegonia will be found in the egg. And then eventually the eggs get fertilized, you'll end up with an embryo and baby sporophyte seed. With the angiosperm, we will talk about an ovule, that word, and the ovule is inside the ovary, so that's kind of new term. So now we have the ovary is the female flower. Inside the ovary are ovules, where that's where you find the egg. And after the sperm gets delivered there, so pollen to have quite the job, growing and growing and growing until finally deliver the sperm for the egg on. Then seed production hopefully will occur, and that's encased in fruit tissue. Now, normally, if I say the word fruit to you, I'm guessing you're thinking about oranges or apples, something like that. But we'll also learn that there are fruits that don't look like fruits, and you've been led to believe they're actually vegetables, but they're technically fruits. So because we're in a botany class, we're going to learn the difference, be able to appreciate what is a true fruit, what's a true vegetable. Okay, flowers, beautiful flowers. So I need you to know most of the anatomy that's being shown here. So typically, when they show a flower, they will show what's called a perfect flower, which means it has both male and female structures in that same flower. Perfect, it has both. If it is a perfect flower, in the center tends to be the female part. So the female is the center of attention. It's going to be in the center of the flower. And you can see that it's composed of stigma, style, and ovary. So the stigma is the part that will be waiting for the pollen. So that's where the pollen grains are going to land. Style is like a stalk. And then at the base of that is the ovary. If you take that all together, all three parts, then you start using the term carpel or pistil. And the way I remembered that for memorizing flower anatomy, my dad would tease me and my sister that women are enigmas, which rhymes with stigma. So that's how I remember the stigma is the top part of the female anatomy. Style, well, women have style, right? So the style is next. And then, of course, women have ovaries. So stigma, style, and ovary. And then my dad always, when he'd get kind of frustrated with me and my sister, he'd say, "Oh, you guys are such pistils." And so it's weird, but I remember it. So pistil or carpel. All right. So then, surrounding the female part of the flower would be the male flower. So male text, so to speak, the female flower, female parts of the flower. So now we have the anther and the filament. And the way I remembered that is anther and the word antler are close. Antlers are on male, I think of deer, male deers having antlers. And then the filaments, well, that actually has the word men in it. So filament is, again, part of the male structure. It's like the stalk that holds up the anther. And then stamen, again, has the word men in it. So whatever trick you need to memorize this, but I definitely will be asking you about flower anatomy on finals. Some of the other parts I want you to memorize are, of course, the petals, the flower petals, and then the sepals are the green looking parts, like when the flower hasn't opened yet and you have the green bud. That's what you see, it's the sepals covering over the flower. And then when the flower blooms, the sepals peel apart essentially and form that phase flower. The other thing I would like you to know are ovules. Of course, inside the ovary are the ovules, so please know that. And then another thing, receptacle. So at the base, right beneath the ovary is the tip of the stem. you know, the flower stalk, the flower stem. And that's given the term receptacle. I need you to know that because when we look at fruit tissue, sometimes we're going to show how the receptacle is a big part of the fruit that you eat. So I'll be pointing that out. So flower anatomy, I think at some point you've had at least some of this, at least this. This is another image, and I put this in here because sometimes you see it described, the carpel or the pistils, they'll say gynoecium, and then the stamen, they'll often say androecium. So you may see that term in lab or through some of these slides. Gynoecium, gyno is female, so, and then andro is male. So just be aware that those are going to show up. Now, if we zoom into the ovary, and the ovary contains the ovules, I just put this here to show you that the design of the ovules can vary. We're not going to get into that. I just want you to appreciate that there's quite a bit of variation in terms of how many ovules, what's their point of attachment, the pattern of how they attach. And they actually do use the word placenta. They use that term. That's where the ovule is attached to, of the placental tissue. So that can vary. And again, it can be, you know, complex or simple. Again, just be aware that you have quite a bit of variation on the design. This one, however, I do need you to know this idea. So this comes into play when we look at the evolutionary process of flowering plants. Ovaries initially, more ancient plants that evolved early on in the angiosperm group, they had superior ovaries. So that means their ovary tissue is sitting kind of on top of the rest of the flower tissue. And then over time, through the evolutionary process, the ovaries get a little bit more protected, so half inferior. And then the more evolutionarily advanced angiosperms, the more current ones, they really have nice inferior ovaries. So it's just a way to like further protect all that precious ovary and ovule. Okay. Now, it's important that you understand in lab, traditionally, when you go to buy slides for an intro botany class, they always give you lily. It's nice on one, there's one huge payoff to looking at lily under the microscope. They have huge parts, really easy to see. They just have really big ovaries, big ovules. Unfortunately, lily do a type of life cycle that's unusual and the one that we don't really focus on. So that gets a little, but we'll come back to this idea. I'll try to remind you. But here, what we're seeing is a flower, female part. So what they did was they took the ovary and cut it in cross section. Now these paired, those are ovules. So a total of 6 ovules in a lily flower. And then the whole thing is our ovary. Okay. So we're going to zoom into that next time and look at what's going on inside those ovules. How do we get egg production? Okay, so we'll get into that, I guess, on Friday.